Welcome back, Gender Justice Now participants, and welcome to everyone joining us on YouTube. My name is Kat Owens, and I am the project director for the Feminist Strategic Litigation Project at the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, or LEAF. I am delighted to welcome you to this fantastic panel on intersectionality and gender justice. Before I turn it over to Rosel Kim, who will be our moderator for today's panel, 3 quick housekeeping items. First, captioning for this event is available in English and in French. English captions should be visible on the video feed on your YouTube screen. For French captions, please use the link that we will share in the YouTube chat now. You should also have received this link in the reminder emails sent out from Eventbrite. Second, the panel will be recorded, and we will share the link with you after the event. We will also be making a recording with French interpretation available at that time. Finally, we've shared a link to our speaker bios in the YouTube chat. You'll also find links there to a report written by 2 of our panelists, which provides a fantastic overview of intersectionality in law and legal contexts. I highly recommend checking it out. And the executive summary of that report is also available in French. I will now turn things over to Rosel Kim, one of LEAF's great staff lawyers, who will be our moderator for this panel. Thank you, Rosel.
Thank you, Kat, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As Kat mentioned, my name is Rosel Kim, and I'm one of the staff lawyers at LEAF. Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Rosel Kim et je suis avocat conseil à l'interne à FEJ. C'est un plaisir pour moi de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette première table ronde sur l'intersectionnalité et justice de genre. Welcome to the first panel discussion of the symposium, where we will be discussing intersectionality and gender justice. Cette séance sera présentée en anglais. So I'm speaking to you today from what is now known as Toronto or Toronto. The land I'm on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also wanted to share these words from Selena Mills and Sarah Rock. The GTA itself is ensconced in a myriad of complications to do with the Upper Canada Treaties, specifically the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Internation Peace Agreement. While this agreement may be widely referenced in Toronto academic and land acknowledgements, there is little to no mention of how it's been broken, like so many other treaties. I want to acknowledge Indigenous territories and histories of where I'm speaking from, including the history of colonial violence that continues in Turtle Island, because without doing so, we cannot achieve true gender justice. I want to remember Joyce Echaquan, who held our system to account by revealing yet another example of structural racism. I mention this because I would like us to reflect on how we should understand this colonial legacy of violations and violence when we talk about intersectionality today. Is it enough to understand coloniality as another intersection? Or is there a need to understand coloniality as a bigger structural force that influences other intersections of oppression? I'll be asking our panelists to reflect on this point later on. So, why intersectionality and why now? You may have been seeing references to the concept recently, and a lot of references for sure. So while I think everybody at this session is familiar with intersectionality, I do want to start by reading a little bit from the report on intersectionality that Kat referenced by 2 of our panelists, Jena McGill and Grace Ajele. So I'm quoting now. So the term intersectionality first attracted widespread attention through the work of Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, an African-American law professor at Columbia University and at the University of California, Los Angeles. I'm skipping a bit ahead in the brief. In two scholarly papers written in 1989 and 1991, Crenshaw critiqued the frameworks of American anti-discrimination law, second-wave feminism, and the civil rights movement, demonstrating how each of these models for remedying oppressions fails Black women. The experiences of Black women are thus untellable in the frameworks of anti-discrimination law, feminism, and the civil rights movement. Crenshaw used the idea of intersectionality to explain the unique composite kinds of discrimination experienced by Black women at the intersection of race and sex. Since then, intersectionality has become a popular and frequently referenced concept in many areas, including feminist, queer, critical race and legal theories, social movements, and cultural discourses too. Despite this prevalence, a question remains: how do we make our outcomes intersectional? For example, the existing anti-discrimination law in Canada still relies heavily on the single-axis grounds analysis to determine the existence of discrimination. The popularity of intersectionality in our culture also brings up another question about whether the term can maintain its political significance. In 2015, journalist LaToya Peterson worried that the label of intersectional feminism was being donned more as a mask of belonging rather than an rally to action. So Peterson's article prompted me to examine how my own relationship is to the term intersectionality. And I appreciated the reminder that I shouldn't be looking at intersectionality as an identity to wear and maybe shield myself from self-reflection just because I know how to use the term and I understand it. Instead, intersectionality should serve us as a reminder to consider the multiplicity of our truths that demand care and attention to advance substantive gender equality. So on that note, the purpose of this panel is to explore the history, the significance, and the reimaginative potential of intersectionality in our work as gender justice advocates, so that we can gain an understanding and appreciation of intersectionality as a tool for action. And we're going to do this through a guided discussion today with our panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. I'll be asking direct questions to each panelist and then engage in a more open discussion at the end about what we hope for the future. We're also leaving time for questions from you. So if you're joining from Zoom, please use the Q&A chat box. And if you're joining us from YouTube, please use the comment feature on YouTube to send us your questions throughout the session. I also want to note as a ground rule that please ensure your questions are free of language that targets or attacks someone because of who they are. We want to ensure that the questions and comments remain free of sexist, racist, ableist, homophobic, transphobic, and other oppressive language. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the panelists for this session: Grace Ajele, Sarah Jama, and Jena McGill. So as Kat mentioned, full bios of each speaker are available in the agenda for the symposium and in the link that was been provided on YouTube. But I'll just give a quick introduction of each speaker. Grace is a domestic violence family lawyer at Calgary Legal Guidance, a nonprofit law firm which aims to guide vulnerable Albertans through the legal system. And Sarah is a community organizer based in Hamilton, Ontario, and co-founder of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, which is an organization committed to building the political and community power of people with disabilities. And Jena is an associate professor of law at the University of Ottawa. Her teaching and research focus on topics including Canadian constitutional law, feminist legal theory, gender, sexuality and the law, and access to justice. So welcome, everybody. And I'd like to now move into the panel discussion. And I am going to start by unpacking the definition of intersectionality a bit further. So my first question is to Jena. And here we have some discussions of intersectionality from the brief. So Jena, you and Grace say in the brief, focusing on identities is only part of the work that intersectionality requires. More difficult are questions of structural inequality and the dynamics that create and maintain systems of identity-based oppression. So can you explain how this idea of structural intersectionality differs from the more conventional understanding of intersectionality?
Sure. Thanks, Rosel, and thanks to Kat and Leaf and all the organizers of this important 3 days of discussions and learning. So structural intersectionality is really about shifting the focus of intersectional work from identities toward the systems of power that make identities the vectors for privilege and marginalization. The term structural intersectionality was coined by professors Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, Sumi Cho, and Leslie McCall, and it emerged as a reaction to the proliferation of a somewhat thinner notion of intersectionality in a lot of popular discourse and in some scholarly applications. And this thinner notion of intersectionality focuses sort of exclusively on identities and on the fact that identities overlap and intersect. This thinner version of intersectionality sees change in terms of expanding identity categories to include sort of an infinite number of differently situated persons or subjects. What's often missing from this thinner notion of intersectionality is attention to connecting experiences of identity-based marginalization to broader systems of power and privilege. So structural intersectionality is intended to shift intersectional arguments away from focusing only or primarily on identities and towards more systemic questions about power. So in this model, in the model of structural intersectionality, change is really concerned with the transformation of systems of intersectional disadvantage. So structural intersectionality tells us it's not just about recognizing intersectional dynamics. The goal is really the transformation of those dynamics for the greater good of people who sit at the intersection of more than one social identity. I'll just end by saying that this idea of structural intersectionality isn't new per se. It's very much a part of the foundational work of intersectionality. All of that work says we have to connect individual experiences of discrimination with broader systemic questions about power and privilege. But as Rosel sort of mentioned, as intersectionality has proliferated and percolated into different kinds of discourse and popular media, in some iterations, it's become a much narrower focus on just the identity question. So structural intersectionality brings us back to sort of the foundational idea of connecting individual experience with broader systems of power.
Thank you so much, Jena. So I want to delve into this question of structure a bit more with Sarah. So Bree, if I could have the next slide. Thank you. So this next question is for Sarah. Your work on disability justice focuses on the need to question capitalist assumptions about humanity, such as prioritizing productivity or our ability to consume as a marker of inclusion. Can you discuss why it's important to recognize this bias when we talk about intersectionality?
Yeah, I think I did Kim did a great job in sort of explaining the ways in which we've seen a liberalization of the term intersectionality to mean just your identity, right? And so when we're talking about people with disabilities, we've seen many structures, for example, that will continue to do that, talk about disabled people as having an identity, but not really talk about the ways in which people with disabilities have been structurally disabled and not allowed to exist simply because we cannot produce. So an example of that would be the creation of medical assistance in dying and the elimination of the foreseeable death portion of MAID, allowing multiple people to apply for medically assisted suicide, while also in tandem allowing people to be in legislated poverty who are disabled. So I'm thinking about the Ontario Disability Support Program and how it has been structured to give people less than a living wage. So people are being told in one vein that they don't have the right to exist, and live equally to everybody else, especially during the pandemic when everybody was making a minimum of $2,000 a month, right? And on this other vein, we have this liberal idea that, you know, people should be allowed to die in dignity while not being able to live with dignity as well. And so when we're talking about intersectionality, it's important not to just talk about people as just having like identities that intersect causing issues. It's not the disability itself that's causing people issues or hardship. It's this idea that over and over and over again, historically, whether you're talking about institutionalization or present day, when you're talking about all the deaths in long-term care home, which are disabled people who are going through COVID and just being locked away, when you're looking at structures that currently exist, over and over again, they intersect to say people with disabilities are not equal to everybody else. And so I think what Kimberly Crenshaw was trying to say when she was writing about intersectionality was not that we should look internally and look at our own intersecting identities in terms of how we operate in society, but the ways in which capitalism and our society has been built to put some people's value over others.
Thank you so much. So now I want to shift a bit to look at how we practice intersectionality within and as individual actors. So if I can have the next slide, thank you. So this question is for Grace. So Grace, in the context of doing legal advocacy on behalf of communities that are marginalized, why is it important to reflect on our positionality as legal advocates?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think positionality, reflecting on our positionality, is a key part of actually understanding the systems that we're trying to challenge. You know, when we talk about structural intersectionality and having sort of a focus on these systems of power and the way they make certain identities vulnerable, I think positionality is actually an important part of that because, you know, it's really about looking at our power and privilege that we may have as a result of our place in society and the ways that that power and privilege manifests in our behavior and our worldview and the ways that we benefit from current systems and the ways that we perpetuate those systems. And I think if we're not understanding that, then we're not really understanding the systemic nature of injustice. You know, it's like the system is sick. And I think if we understand that the system is sick, we need to understand how we've been infected in some ways and how we sort of carry that sickness with us. I think if we're not understanding our role in a system, then we're really not understanding the system. And so I think, you know, in the first place, I think it's a really important part of understanding the system we're trying to challenge. In a practical sense, I think it also helps us to be aware of sort of the power dynamic between us and clients. And it helps us understand maybe what we represent to a client, the ways that they might not trust us or feel comfortable around us because of the role of power that we may represent. And it also helps us take a step back and check ourselves, check our sort of biases, our tendencies, things that we do as a result of our privilege and power. We can kind of filter, I think, our clients' stories and experiences through our own worldview. And I think when we're aware of our positionality, we're taking a minute to stop and think and be reminded that it's the client's worldview and perspective that should be centered, not ours.
Thank you so much. So I've heard that the system is not natural, it is not static, and it continues to change in ways that may be harmful to us, and that we have to be cognizant to that, and that our intersectionality is not just asking us to look at what's already there, but also to really look at the system as a whole and to continue to reflect on ourselves. So just a reminder, including myself, that we are being interpreted. So to speak a bit more slowly and clearly, which I'm going to try to do. So I want to now talk a bit about how intersectionality has been applied or has not been applied with our respective fields of work. So this question is for Sarah. Could you discuss what intersectional organizing looks like? And what have been some successful examples of intersectional organizing?
I think for me, the best kind of organizing is organizing that centers the most marginalized. And that's one of the principles that Sins Invalid came up with when they were just creating the framework of disability justice as a whole. It's this idea that we're not speaking for people, but you're actually working with the communities that you claim to represent. Oftentimes when we talk about organizing, it can be pretty performative. It could be like people posting online with theory and but it's not actually about going out and meeting and talking to people and supporting your communities. An example of proper, I think, community organizing is mutual aid, which has existed for generations, run by Indigenous, Black, queer communities. It's just this idea that we don't need the state in order to survive, that we can actually provide care for each other. And I think good organizing centers those principles.
Thank you. So to broaden the scope to law then, Jena, can you discuss how intersectionality reveals the shortcomings of the law's approach to discrimination, anti-discrimination law?
Thanks, Rosel. So as you mentioned in your intro, intersectionality's critique of anti-discrimination law is based on or flows from the shortcomings of what is often called the single axis model of assessing and redressing discrimination. So the single axis model treats each identity-based ground of discrimination, so sex or race or disability, as exclusive from the rest. And indeed, in Canada, we see that courts have overwhelmingly adjudicated discrimination claims under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as under the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Human Rights Acts, with reference to just one of the numerous prohibited grounds of discrimination. So intersectionality calls out a number of problems with this single axis approach, and I'll maybe just point to three of the key critiques that intersectionality brings. So first, intersectionality makes clear that single axis frameworks don't reflect people's lived experiences, right? They make the stories of those with intersectional identities, Black women, Indigenous lesbians, older women, impossible to tell in anti-discrimination law because the stories have to be distilled to sort of only reflect a single ground. Second, intersectionality reveals that single axis approaches tend to essentialize the experiences of everyone within a given category. So, for example, single axis approaches will often assume that any claimant alleging discrimination based on, say, disability will have a similar experience, or the contours of the claim must look similar. And this flows from the fact that single axis analyses don't engage with, for example, how a claimant's race or how a claimant's gender identity impacts their experiences and changes their experience of disability discrimination. Finally, and related to the former, single axis frameworks tend to rely on pretty simplistic, sort of limited understandings of identity. So single axis frameworks tend to assume that identity categories reflect like objective facts about our innate characteristics, right? Things that you can objectively see, well, that's the content of an identity category. And one thing that intersectionality brings is a much more complex view of identity, right? So intersectionality views identity categories not as describing group characteristics, but as the result of and as a way of maintaining interlocking systems of power that structure relationships of inequality. So, single axis frameworks don't get at that depth when we're talking about what identity means. So ultimately, intersectionality reveals that the single axis model for assessing discrimination distorts the true nature of intersectional claims. As a result, we know that courts may fail to see intersectional discrimination where it does exist. And as a result, they're going to be unlikely to be able to offer meaningful remedies that truly redress the roots of intersectional discrimination because they can't see the full picture of the claimant's experience.
Thank you very much, Jena. if we have time, I think it'd be great to talk about the recent Supreme Court decision in Fraser in relation to what we're talking about. But I want to turn to Grace before that and ask if you can discuss ways in which intersectionality has been used in other areas of the law outside of anti-discrimination law, and what is the court's record there?
Yeah, so in the brief Jena and I wrote, we focused on criminal, family, and immigration and refugee law. In the criminal context, we see advocates making arguments that those with intersecting identities are the ones who are often most heavily criminalized. So, for example, at the intersection of class, race, and gender, sex workers have been heavily criminalized. And advocates are really focusing on the legislation itself and how legislation is implemented and how that criminalizes certain people. There's also, I think, some recognition on the court's part that a more holistic approach to sentencing is necessary, particularly when it comes to Indigenous offenders with GLADU analyses. And, where there's that recognition, we haven't seen this really translate into a robust sort of intersectional framework, more just the recognition that certain populations are overrepresented in the criminal legal system. In family law, advocates have really been raising the question of how legislation can better contemplate people who are not the middle class, white, heterosexual man. And so they've done this by addressing how, for example, at the intersection of gender and class, women are often at an economic disadvantage when leaving a heterosexual relationship because they carry the burden of domestic labor. So really just pointing out a need for a more intersectional approach when creating legislation, contemplating these groups of people. Perhaps refugee law is the best area where intersectionality is reflected. When refugees make a claim, they have to do so on the basis of a fear of being persecuted on different grounds, so race, religion, nationality, etc. And the federal court is now stating that when officers are assessing this fear of persecution, whether someone has this fear of persecution, they shouldn't look at the categories separately. They shouldn't look at race on its own or nationality on its own. If someone experiences oppression on several grounds, that needs to be looked at holistically. And they're explicitly stating that an intersectional approach should be used. So, intersectionality is having some influence in different areas, but we definitely have yet to see courts adopt sort of an intersectional framework to adjudicating cases overall.
Thank you for those insights. I guess I just had a quick follow-up question about, do you have a theory about why intersectionality has been better embraced in refugee law as opposed to other areas?
I haven't thought about it terribly in depth. I think off the top of my head, where there is a real focus on sort of protecting an individual or really looking at an individual's experience to sort of understand what's going on, I think that it's more clear how important intersectionality is, because we are whole human beings. I think where the focus in some of these other areas of law, like criminal law and family law, can be more on justice and putting away bad people, and like that hinders, I think, an ability to really look at people's experience holistically. Maybe the focus is more so on preserving some kind of, I don't know, the idea of safety or, different things like that, or the family, or, whatever.
Great. Thanks for that additional insight. So now that we've been talking about how intersectionality has been applied, how we've understood it, I want to move to a discussion about the future and what we should do with this knowledge that we have. So my next question is for Sarah. So you write in your essay in the collection, Until We Are Free, that we need to shift our approach to intersectionality as one of action. And you call us to dismantle oppressive systems. And that stood out to me because, as I mentioned in my introduction, I think often we understand intersectionality as a way of seeing. And I see descriptions of intersectionality like being a prism, but not necessarily always as a way of doing. So how do we ensure that we are acting and mobilizing in intersectional ways? And you gave an example of mutual aid as a good way of intersectional organizing during this time. And I'm wondering if you have any other tips or any other thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the ways that we can actually organize and work toward creating a world where we don't even need intersectionality as a concept to even exist would be to, when you're engaging in systems that are harmful to people with multiple intersecting identities, like being able to name that and see the history and trajectory of that. So like the carceral system and the ways in which it uses the same language of coloniality and oppression and anti-Black racism to perpetuate the slave trade was also the same language that has been used and continues to be used to say that people with disabilities don't deserve to live equally and freely. It's the same idea that because of the way that we are, we're inherently different, right? It's a concept that's not real. And the ways in which there is a school to prison pipeline for Black youth, there's a similar pipeline for disabled people in this country too, right? So being able to take this idea of intersectionality and use it as a lens to look at and critique systems is where we need to go in order to make sure that we're being able to dismantle and recreate systems that actually are not harmful, right? And overall poke holes in capitalism and this idea that, we need to have carceral states, or we need to have, these conversations in policy, but then in practice, we're still upholding systems that are overly carceral, allowing people to be imprisoned, right? That is the framework of law as a whole, right? The law exists to uphold this system that is causing harm to people, right? Like lawyers exist to do that. And so I think being able to examine that and our role in it is a step toward doing the work to rebuild systems and not just uphold it and not just write the policy, but figuring out how to do that on the ground. And I think it's a hard question to ask, but I think it's a legitimate one. Other things I would think to do is, just making sure that we're not focused just in our ivory towers of writing policy and what we think makes sense, for us in our circles, but what are the ways as lawyers we make ourselves uncomfortable every single day because of our positions of power? How are you meeting communities that you never talk to? For me, it's super easy for me to get up and speak because I don't require ASL, I don't require assistive devices to communicate and to be on panels. But how are you making sure you're hearing from people who don't have the same privileges to communicate that I do? Right? And so I think these are questions you should always ask yourself. What are the ways that you'll be uncomfortable, that you'll access information that makes you uncomfortable every single day? And that's a step in the right direction.
Thank you so much. And that's a great reminder that we should be feeling uncomfortable every day, because that's really the way to expose our positions of power. So I guess, and this tension between being legal advocates, upholding the system of power, and using that to advance equality is already a theme that we started talking about at the beginning of this session. So I guess now I want to ask the legal advocates on the panel. So I'll start with Grace. How do we shift our understanding of intersectionality as a tool for action as opposed to perception?
I think it's such an important question because I think with any good theory or information or insight that we gain, we should always be asking ourselves, what do I do with this? How does this change the way I operate? We talk briefly in our report about allyship in advocacy. And I think a really important piece of that, which I touched on briefly before, is centering the client's voice, centering the client's experience. I think a big part of the culture of law is paternalism, and sort of getting into a situation with our ideas about evidence and relevance and, what's important, what's not. And I think really understanding that the client is the expert in their own experience, and that they are the ones who are going to be able to highlight the nuance of their reality. If we really want to be intersectional in our practice, we have to let those with an intersectional experience lead the way in that. And so I think that that's really important, is sort of really letting the client frame their own experience, and letting them be the expert in that. I also think education is really important. I think once we sort of grasp intersectionality as a lens, we have a responsibility to deepen our on the ground understanding of that, and really educate ourselves on the experience of others, and not rely on clients or personal interactions to get us up to speed on what it's like to live in a different identity. I think that education is really important. And I think with that education, we need to be constantly asking, okay, what am I doing with the insight I'm gaining?
Thank you so much. A lot of important insights here about, I think really questioning this idea of inclusion and what it really means to center someone's voice. So I want to now touch upon one of the critiques of intersectionality that I think is worth discussing, and which I referenced to earlier. So I think I saw the slide with Sarah Hunt's quote be shared earlier. So we can just bring that up. So Jena and Grace, you cite Sarah Hunt in your brief, who states that it's not enough to just include colonialism as another axis or intersection of oppression to consider, because colonialism conditions the whole matrix of intersecting systems of power in colonized spaces. So I'd like each of you to actually reflect on this point, and what is the responsibilities of settlers when we incorporate intersectionality into our work. Maybe I'll ask Jena to go first.
Sure, thanks. So we rely on Sarah Hunt's work in the broader, her work. A lot of her work is interested in looking at the sort of connections and disconnections between intersectionality and Indigenous knowledges and worldviews. And I think what's one of the things that flows from her work broadly and from this quote for me is that her work reminds us that intersectionality it's a culturally specific concept, and it's based on a Western worldview that's founded on these colonial categories: sex, gender, race, class, right? So while intersectionality might be useful in terms of making sense of overlap and intersections between those categories, we can't take for granted, or people interested in employing intersectionality shouldn't take for granted this sort of global applicability or global relevance of those identity categories, right? Another part of Hunt's work is revealing how, for some Indigenous communities, this idea of people and ideas and identities being interconnected, the connections between people and the natural world, like they don't need intersectionality. They don't need a fancy word for that idea, right? It's already an inherent part of their social and cultural norms. And so the idea of intersectionality doesn't resonate in any new or particularly productive way for some in some Indigenous worldviews. So, when I'm thinking particularly about, I come at some of this work through the lens of scholarship and activism at the intersection of sexuality and gender. And so I think about how the concept of two-spirit is often translated into LGBTQ Indigenous person, when really, right, Indigenous people tell us, well, two-spirit is actually culturally and experientially totally distinct from the very rigid categories of sexual orientation and gender identity that tend to characterize Western worldviews. So, I think in terms of using intersectionality, it shouldn't be assumed that this is going to be something that has resonance across, across a diversity of cultures, across a diversity of geographies, across a diversity of communities, because it is a very specific concept. It came out of the critical race movement in America at a very certain time period, and it takes with it that history, right? So, Rosel, at the beginning, you talked about sort of the political currency that intersectionality has right now in a lot of different domains. And I think maybe one of the things that calls into question how much that currency will continue is this idea of, well, how broadly applicable is it, right? And I think Hunt's work demonstrates that we have to be really cognizant of the fact that it does have particular cultural content that won't necessarily resonate across contexts. I'll leave it there.
Is this open to everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, I would also add that intersectionality, just in the everyday use of it, has been, I feel, co-opted by non-people of color, not Black people. It's being used as a way for, I find, often white liberal activists to position themselves in spaces where work is happening that don't center the voices of the most marginalized in the room. And it's being in today's day and age utilized as a way to move forward personal expression of experience rather than allow room for community and community critique of systems that have caused that identity to exist in the first place. And so I think I don't, to your point in the beginning of the panel, exploring whether or not the term has relevancy in today's day and age, I think it does. I think it's just been mainstreamed and co-opted, which is the whole reason the concept of womanism was created in the first place, right? Because at that time, the concept of feminism didn't really fit Black and racialized people. I see that happening over and over and over again. So I don't know if it's a question of adding in boxes, right? Adding in colonialism as a point on the axis of identity. I think it's rather that we need to stop seeing it as a way to just put in boxes. We just need to see it as a way to critique structures that currently exist. Because if we keep trying to add layers to it, it's going to continue to just lose its meaning. The people who need to know that colonialism is a factor, know that colonialism is a factor when we're talking about identity. The people who don't need that are the ones who need these definitions to be in rigid forms. Yeah, but if that makes any sense.
Definitely does, yeah. And I think one of the questions that also came up was how do we make these concepts accessible, which maybe we can discuss later on as well. I'll ask Grace if she has anything to add before we move on.
Yeah, I think on that note of considering coloniality as another sort of point on the axis versus realizing how it sort of informs everything. I think that's really important when it comes to, for example, using the legal system. I think it's super important to remember the foundations of the systems that we use and how they were built, and that the impact of that is still very real. And so, I think sometimes it's easy to talk about these systems as sort of neutral systems that impact our lives, but they are not neutral. They were created in particular ways, and they target certain identities. And I think because as a result of that, we have a responsibility when we're incorporating intersectionality into our practice. We have a responsibility to really question all aspects of the ways that we practice and of the tools that we use. I think, you know, as a lawyer, it can be from the way a courtroom is set up, you know, to the way that legislation is created and implemented. But I think we have to be willing to hear critiques that go to the very core of our systems. Like, we have to loosen our grip a little bit on the way things are done, and just assuming that is neutral and good and that it works for everyone. I think we really need to be willing to sort of look at the foundations of some of these systems that we use, not just the symptomatic practices.
Great, thank you, Grace. I actually wanted to go back to something Sarah said before we move on. We were talking about co-optation and mainstreaming of certain terms. Is there a way to guard against that? Do you think there's something we should do to keep the political nature of a term? Sarah, are you still with us?
Yeah, sorry, my mic is being interesting. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so we were so you were mentioning the co-opting and mainstreaming of the term intersectionality, which has happened to other political concepts as well. So are there things you think we should do to keep the political significance of intersectionality?
I don't put so much weight though behind terminology. Like, I get that it's useful in like legal context, but the dangers that I see with some of the ways in which we've like focused so much on identity is now people use the term identity politics, right? And it gets lobbied against Black, racialized people of color who are doing work to challenge systems to say, oh, they're just an identity politician. But really, the people that we're usually pushing against, you know, the white cis men who don't want to allow systems to change are also identity politicians, because they too have intersecting identities on those axes, but they're on an axis of power, right? And so I think I don't really abide by just focusing on terms, because I think that they're fluid, and as long as we're doing the work to challenge the systems that have pushed for the creation of these terms to begin with, I'm not too fixated on like needing to define things and put them into boxes, because I think it often does more harm than good. And usually the terminology that's being used in the grassroots is not in line with the terminology being used in academic spheres. So now, for example, the term disability justice is beginning to become mainstream, but it's not yet been co-opted by academia. It's on the way there, but that term is completely different than the terminology being used in academic spaces around access and inclusion. And the meaning of disability justice, which is similar, right? It's not a focus on the individual, but it's a focus on structural change. On the outside in, like those two terms, access and inclusion versus disability justice, are just different. And so each time we see a movement of these terms into mainstream, it changes the meaning of it, the weight of it, and the impact. And so I think actually academics should be the ones to inquire in terms of like, how can we stop allowing these terms to become mainstream? So when we're using it in our writing, are we also using it in our practices? I think that's a step. Because for me on the outside, I'm not super fixated on terminology.
Thank you. That was helpful. So there's been a lot that's been brought up, and there's been a lot of questions that's been coming in as well. So I'm glad that we'll have some time to post some, to ask some of them and explore them together. But before that, I'm wondering if each of you can just share some tips, calls for action that you want to leave the group with to make intersectional advocacy and organizing actually possible. Maybe Grace, I'll start with you this time.
Sure. So this is something we addressed a little bit in the brief as well, and it's something that really resonates with me. It's this idea of being persistent in our listening, our learning, our unlearning, our willingness to accept criticism, and then our willingness to continue showing up after accepting criticism. I think it is inevitable that we're going to get some things wrong. I think it's also very easy to get overwhelmed because there's so much to be done. And I really believe that what we're trying to address is at such a deep foundational level that it's almost a matter of like, how do we start over? Like, how do we really, really get to the root of these issues? And so I think it's really easy to get overwhelmed. But I think that when we recognize it's not about us and our egos and what we can accomplish, but it's about advancing the goal of equality, I think that should change our perspective a bit. And I think there's a lot of power in just showing up as we are, and acknowledging our shortcomings, but then educating ourselves, taking in feedback, and continuing to show up and challenge systems and challenge ourselves and really listen to those whose experience is intersectional. Like, those are the people that should be leading the way in this movement.
Thank you. Jena?
Yeah, gosh, I think Sarah's last intervention was really important, and this question of, what we call it matters less than what's actually happening. And so to the extent that like the term intersectionality, right, one of the big critiques is like, it's just academic jargon, doesn't have any connection to what's really happening in people's lives. Whether we label a certain initiative, a certain movement, certain kinds of work, whether we label it intersectional or not, is secondary to the more primary question of the nature of the work that's going on there, right? The goals, the nature of the relationships between, like, who's at the center of the movement, whose voices are being heard, who's doing what kinds of advocacy in what spheres and with what benchmarks, right? Like, all of these things matter more. That, like, if intersectionality is not a useful framework, I don't think there's any, imperative to use that term if it doesn't resonate, right? I think it's important to remember that, like, although Professor Kimberly Crenshaw is often credited as sort of like the founder of intersectionality, one of the things that Grace and I sort of track a little bit in our brief that we prepared is that actually, although that is an originating moment for the term intersectionality, intersectional work was happening long before the 80s and 90s, right? And not just in, like, we see examples of intersectional writing by Indigenous women, by Latinx women, by Black women, right? Like, across a whole spectrum of persons and locations. And they weren't using the term intersectionality, but when we look, like, you can see the work is clearly intersectional, right? So I guess I would just echo, I think, and thanks, Sarah, for that point, because I think that's important, that, to the extent that it doesn't feel like a useful framework, what matters more is, as Grace says, staying present in and committed to the work of transformation, because really Crenshaw's work and the intersectional work that preceded it, the call isn't just for recognizing more identities, or the call isn't for just, acknowledging, like, oh yes, this person's experience of discrimination is this different from this one by virtue of an intersectional identity. That's fine, but, getting through that to the so what question, I think, is the important moment, right? So, well, why is it that these two experiences are so different, right? Why is it? What are the systems of power? And I think one thing that occurred to me is that we didn't do a great job sussing out what we mean when we say systems of power. For me, I'm thinking, like, for sure, like capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, the carceral system, the legal system, all the administrative systems that control the little bitty bits of our lives, right? All of those things, the way that they intersect to mean that some people sit in positions of privilege and others do not, right? Like, being aware that, like, that's not an accident. And so I think to the degree that we can get past the identitarian moment and into that more systemic or that systems-based moment, the intersectional work is happening no matter what you call it.
Thank you so much. Sarah.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said there, Jena. And I also think that it's on us to examine if we really truly believe equality is attainable within the systems that we're operating in. Like, what is it we as lawyers are actually pushing for? Do we really believe that, like, the systems that we are trying to support people individually, the work that we're doing is enough to sort of address inequality, address systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, police brutality, the carceral state, address these systems of power, right, head on. And I think those are the questions that I'm interested in. We each do, as Grace said, have an individual role to play, but that individual role, I think, needs to be positioned with, okay, what can I do in the position that I'm in to build, if not directly participate, to build the work that people are doing, whether that's like providing resources to people who are directly challenging people with power, people in positions of power that are harming others, or providing support academically to people who are doing that work on the ground who might need it. I think, like, the question to ask yourself here for everybody on the call is, what am I doing to sort of create a world where we don't need intersectionality to even exist as a term, right? And how am I building toward that future?
I think that's a great call. So thank you for that. So we've received a lot of questions from everyone. And I know Jena has to sign off a little bit early at 2:30. So I'm glad that we'll have some time to ask some of those questions to you. There was a question about terminology, which I'll pose to anyone who wants to answer. So does structural intersectionality suggest we should resist referring to those impacted by systems of power as vulnerable, because vulnerability places too much focus on the individual rather than the broader system?
There's nothing inherently wrong with vulnerability. I think vulnerability can definitely be, like, the vulnerability for who? Like, vulnerability in a packaged sense to the public, I think, is harmful. Vulnerability in the sense that it allows you to connect and build community is actually quite powerful, right? So when we're talking about, I think it's just this idea that people have now marketed and packaged and exported intersectional, like, frameworks and identities to be able to, like, it's like the Obama effect, right? The idea that you can be the first something, the first Black person, the first disabled person to speak at a thing, right? And still perpetuate the systems that exist in the same way that they are. That's like neoliberalism in and of itself. And I think people have used vulnerability as a tool to move that along. The idea that, I have this experience and therefore I can speak to this thing. I think that's dangerous, and that's a neoliberal way of, like, looking at vulnerability. But vulnerability in terms of, like, there's no way to do grassroots community work without being vulnerable with one another, because organizing requires trust, a certain level of trust that you cannot just have with everybody who's not doing that work, right? And so, I don't know. I see it as, like, useful and not useful depending on your context.
Thank you. And I think that's a great, like, unpacking of vulnerable as being open, and there's, on the one hand, there's openness and honesty with one another and accountability perhaps, but also this idea of being powerless, that I guess is what you're speaking to. And I guess the follow-up I would say to that is, should we say marginalized? Like, how do we best capture the system's operation? So like people who are marginalized, people who are vulnerable, or are these terminologies in them, like, themselves problematic?
I'd agree. I think what structural intersectionality suggests about the term vulnerable is the insight that, a person's vulnerability doesn't result from their innate characteristics. a person is made vulnerable by virtue of the operation of certain systems in society, right? That dictate hierarchies of privilege and disprivilege. So I think what structural intersectionality brings is just, you know, a different centering of sort of like where that vulnerability flows from or resides, that it's not a matter of a person's, you know, individual characteristics, that it's something that it's like a force that exists, that happens outside of the individual. So that I think is an important like shift, right? When you see like, where does that vulnerability reside? It's not about the innate vulnerability of the person. I think that maybe for me is one thing that structural intersectionality brings to that question. And maybe I'll let someone else chime in on the second part of your question, Rosel.
I can also move on to another question because we have a few. So there was a question for Grace about positionality, which asked, who decides the positionality of an individual in society?
I'm not sure if I entirely understand the question, but I think, you know, my attempt to answer the question would be, we all have certain identities that carry with them power, or that have been, you know, marginalized, to kind of use the term that we're just talking about. And so, you know, as a Black person, I experience certain marginalization in society. As a woman, I experience certain marginalization in society. From an intersectional perspective, as a Black woman, I experience certain marginalization in society, but I also, you know, am a lawyer. I have class privilege. I have, you know, I'm in a heterosexual relationship. There's any number of, you know, I'm able-bodied, I'm cisgendered, like I could go on. And I'm not sure if this is a question of someone deciding, but I think the reality is that there are certain identities that carry with them privilege and power. And to the extent that I identify with those identities, you know, I carry that privilege and power, whether I feel like I've been privileged in my life or not. I carry that privilege and power. And similar to my identities, you know, parts of my identity that have been marginalized, I think it's similar. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Thank you. So there was another question open to all that asked about, what are some ways to identify and dismantle biases that exist in the actors within the systems? So the person asked, gave an example of the Yukon RCMP, which only has a single line in the sexual assault response policy that says, if you have biases, override them and treat people equally.
I'm kind of over like statements that dictate the action that we should take, that exists in systems that we never follow. How many police departments have put out, you know, commitments to anti-racism practices, and have disavowed sexual harassment, and yet there's a federal case against the RCMP around sexual harassment, and people continue to be killed by police. Like, it's about not focusing on the statement that your organization or your groups or people in positions of power or your organization are putting out, and actually looking at the ways you critically are doing the work to stop harming certain groups, and to take a step back and to evaluate why this harm is continuing. Like, why do police continue to harm disabled people, Black people, racialized people, Indigenous people over and over and over again, right? A statement and a policy is not going to do that work. It's going to be on the people outside of those systems to do that work for them. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the systems that exist that are the most harmful have been created to be harmful, right? Bill C-51 says that, you know, organizers, climate activists, indigenous people are terrorists. Like there is legislation that exists that continues to prevent people from changing legislation. And so we can't just keep, you know, referring to it and looking for what to put into it in order to create that change. It takes taking a step back and like evaluating why these systems are the way they are and looking to see who's doing that work and how to support them from the outside to change the systems. Because statements, policy will go far, but they won't go far enough. It's the difference between reform and revolution. In a literal sense is what's needed.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting example about if you have biases, figure it out. You know, the idea, so there's like a few dimensions, right? I don't think there's a single target for the work of changing those ingrained stereotypes, those ingrained ways of thinking, those ingrained, you know, the things that we take for granted at the locations of privilege that we sit at. You know, so it's not a case of sort of like just changing the bad apples, but leaving the system intact. And like the police is a great example, right? Because for a long time, we've heard arguments from the police like, oh, you know, this police officer who murdered a civilian is just a bad apple, just a singular case. And that deflected away from asking much broader questions about like how the whole system of policing endorses violence among white men, frankly, right? And so, you know, part of the change, like this sort of, I'm just looking at the language here, like this sort of policy piece suggests that the problem resides in each individual RCMP officer. Like all y'all got to figure it out and then move on. And doing that, I'm going to guess maybe, allows the organization or the institution to feel like it doesn't have to do anything at the broader levels of leadership, right? Of changing the social and cultural norms of the institution, which we know have in the policing context, you know, forever bred systems of violence, of othering racialized populations and women and, you know, all of these people who were disproportionately targeted by the police. So, you know, I think we can't assume that all of that work happens at the individual level. It has to be at the institutional and systemic levels as well. So part of that is a matter of leadership. You know, a policy is maybe a starting point, but it's never going to be sufficient to just tell people to, you know, figure out and then get over their biases. We all carry implicit bias that we're totally unconscious of. And so there has to be something within the organization to control for moments where that unconscious implicit bias risks playing out in ways that are detrimental or even deadly to certain people.
Thank you. Grace, did you have anything to add?
No, I think Sarah and Jena really touched on the important points very well. I think I'm again, big believer in, like Audre Lorde says, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And that's something I think, you know, working as a lawyer within the system, I really honestly struggle with, because we can offer suggestions, we can talk about practices and instituting different things, but ultimately, I think a lot of the systems that are in place are fundamentally problematic, and they are fundamentally discriminatory. And I think unless we're really willing to look at that, we're really going to be slapping band-aids on really deep wounds.
Thank you. Speaking of deep wounds caused by systems, here's another question about the system. So here's a question. I would like to hear the panelists' thoughts on how the justice system can address the inequities in legal proceedings. There's a history of discrimination and racial profiling in the court system, which create a lot of misconceptions and biases about Black people. Presumably, intersectionality is often considered in criminal cases and child protection hearings, where Blackness is often viewed negatively. Grace, you touched upon this a little bit when you talked about positionality. So, further thoughts?
Yeah, I think, again, and I'm probably sounding a bit like a broken record here, but I think these solutions have to go really deep. I think things as simple, for example, as the way a courtroom is set up. I think that is one thing that really sort of perpetuates the power imbalance, the power dynamic. I know this isn't speaking specifically to the comment on views of Black people and things like that, but I think that's one very practical thing that in legal proceedings, that's one way of addressing how legal proceedings play out. There's, in the work that I do in domestic violence family law, our program at Calgary Legal Guidance is really trying to focus on autonomy of the individual and empowering them to sort of, with knowledge and with advice, to be able to represent themselves. We get a lot of push, of course, from the community to take on files and to represent clients. But, even in discussions with my team recently, we've discussed that, why is there such a focus on sort of legal actors coming in and rescuing clients and being the bridging the gap between them and the legal system? Why is there not more of a focus on making the legal system a place where people can be heard and people cannot feel as if they are drowning or just, completely powerless? So I think in terms of practical approaches, I think we as a legal system need to start reevaluating how sort of the gap between us and people who participate in our system, it's not working. I don't think it's it's functioning healthily anyways. And so I think we need to start looking at ways like, for example, restructuring the way a courtroom looks, and restructuring maybe even the way that the adversarial system functions. I think these are things we need to be willing to address.
Thank you. It's very helpful. So continuing with the legal questions until Jena has to go, because I think Jena has to go soon. There was a question that asked to expand and clarify the critique of access-based anti-discrimination law. So the person asked, is your point that access-based analysis tends to focus only on one axis and should focus on multiple axes? Or is the point that an axis-based assessment of discrimination will always fail, as in we should rebuild a new systemic assessment of discrimination?
This is a great question. Thanks to whoever posed it. And I'm sorry that I do have to sign off early. I have a situation where I have like a kid with a runny nose, and although it's not COVID, I can't send them to childcare and yada, 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 yada. Anyways, so yeah, this is great. So I guess intersectionality's critique of access-based discrimination, anti-discrimination law, is not as simple as saying, well, can't courts just consider like 2 or 3 axes, right? So can't you just sort of say like, oh, well, gender plus immigration status, put them together, and then you've got an intersectional analysis. Indeed, we have seen some instances in Canadian law where courts have done this kind of approach, which is sort of sometimes called an additive approach. So it's like, gender-based discrimination plus discrimination based on immigration status equals, right, some doubly bad kind of discrimination. And that's certainly not what intersectionality calls for, right? So intersectionality, I think, calls for a couple of things. Certainly a move away from forcing claimants to only rely on one ground, right? Because as I don't remember who said it earlier, like we all are located at various intersections of privilege in some moments and disprivilege in others, right? That's sort of universal. We don't often talk about the intersectional identities of people who we perceive to be sitting at a whole bunch of locations of privilege, right? But for sure, that's across the board. So intersectionality doesn't just say, first and foremost says, don't force us to look at just one ground, because that doesn't reflect truth, right? Doesn't reflect reality. And it morphs the claim in a way that means you don't get the full picture of what the discrimination looked like. But I don't think, it would not be an intersectional analysis to just simply add two notions of discrimination together and see what comes out the other side. Intersectionality's point is that at the intersection of, I'll use race and sex, which was Crenshaw's original example, that kind of discrimination, the kind of discrimination experienced by Black women in her example, is different in kind than discrimination experienced by white women and discrimination experienced by Black men, right? So you can't just add race-based discrimination, which always takes men, right, as a given. And you can't just add sex-based discrimination, which just takes women as, or which takes whiteness as a given, right? Intersectionality says, no, the experience of Black women is totally unique in kind, and anti-discrimination law can't attend to that uniqueness because it demands that we fit our claims, fit our identities, our experiences into these preconceived boxes. So, you know, I think people, so intersectionality scholars have posited a few different ideas for moving forward, you know, by improving the ability of intersectional arguments to resonate in this grounds-based arena of anti-discrimination law. So, for example, one argument suggests getting rid of grounds altogether, right? Saying we need a more holistic model of what discrimination looks like. We shouldn't be forcing claimants to tell their story through identity. We should find other sort of like hooks to hang our hats on, right, when we're talking about discrimination. And so grounds aren't useful. Now, other folks say actually grounds are really useful. And if you look at the American experience, which doesn't rely on grounds in the same way, you see that part of the reason that we have grounds in anti-discrimination law is to guard against claims by relatively more privileged individuals, right? That a law that looks like it discriminates. So for example, a law that reserves a certain number of seats in a medical school for Black or racialized applicants. And then the white applicant comes along and says, that's discrimination. You're treating me differently. It's discrimination. We know in the US, those claims go forward and frankly succeed, right? Part of the grounds model says, well, no, right? We're not going to do that here. Our substantive understanding of equality is going to focus on grounds, which are sort of historical markers of marginalization and oppression. Others have said it's possible to use grounds and just interpret them far more broadly and far more deeply than we are now, right? So now when we see courts looking at grounds, it's often just a tick box, right? So, you know, was this person discriminated against on the basis of sex? Well, they're a woman and it looks like women were treated differently, check. No more analysis, right? So maybe it's possible to conceive of a grounds-based analysis that permits for a much broader assessment of what discrimination based on sexual orientation looks like, because it doesn't just require me to tell my story through sexual orientation. It also includes telling my story through race and gender identity and disability and immigration, right? Like it includes all the factors that condition and that set the contours of my particular experience of discrimination based on sexual orientation. That was a long-winded answer for which I apologize. But thanks again for your question. And I hope that that clarified a little bit what intersectionality is saying about the shortcomings of grounds. The real key is forcing claims into one ground, not appropriate.
Thank you so much, Jena. I know we've kept you a little bit past of your available time, so appreciate that and appreciate that explanation. I have a question for Sarah. This was about the discussion about words and their significance. So the question asks, doesn't this lead to an impasse though? We hear that words matter and words are violence, and at the same time, we're hearing terminology doesn't matter as much?
I think it's more about like, who are we centering when we're talking about language in the first place, right? The reason language is harmful and it's violent is because the people deciding to use certain language that is violent, like the N-word or any other sort of term that denotes violence, are people in positions of power who tend to do that intentionally. I think language is important but this conversation around language tends to happen in the ivory tower of academia first, and not really at the grassroots first, right? So the language usually isn't just developed and created for and by people who use that language, right? If that makes sense. And so, yes, language is important. Language has power. Vulnerability has power. All these things have power, but it's not meant to be used as a weapon to make people who are not part of these communities feel closer to these communities. They're not tools to move you closer to understanding, right? But I think they're often used as that in ways that are harmful to community, right? So then you have like intersectionality get co-opted. You have terms like, oh, these are identity politicians getting thrown at us, the people doing the work, right? And they use intersectionality as the base to make the argument against identity politics, when really that in itself is something an identity politician would do, right? Somebody who's trying to use this language to understand how to position themselves to have power over the people critiquing them. And so where I get lost on the importance of language is like, it shouldn't be seen as more important than the work itself. I don't care what language you're using if you're doing the work, but there's usually that disconnect. And so for me, when I critique language and how it's overused or not used in certain contexts, I'm just saying, if you're going to use the word intersectionality to explain who you are and explain your work, make sure you're actually doing the work to understand different intersectional experiences. So I gave the example earlier of how like often I'll get asked to public speak, but my experience as a disabled Black woman is not the experience of the most marginalized, to use that term, in our communities, right? I'm not going to go into all my intersecting identity points because I don't think it's necessary, but how are you going to do the work to learn about the experiences of people who are unlike me, who have similar identities, right? Because they're all different, right? And they all sit differently in terms of power and privilege, like what Grace was saying. And so it's like, it's less about using terms that make you feel like you're understanding things or that you're making people feel comfortable because you use the term, and more about, okay, like how are you doing the work to actually understand the impact of that word, the history of the word, and what it means, right? And so people who are using words violently are not doing that work. They're doing that on purpose. And so are the people who are co-opting in a way. It's just be critical when you're using terms. Don't just use it because you feel like it's a cool term that is now created for you to use.
Thanks, Sarah. I think it's a good reminder to talk about the gatekeeping functions of language that can be inadvertent. We have a couple minutes, so maybe the last question I'll ask is, I think people are interested in accessing more information on this topic. So if you have any suggestions for further reading or courses, love to hear from both of you.
I would check out, if y'all are interested in like disability justice and where that came from, check out the work done by Sins Invalid. The term was created by Sins Invalid. They're a queer, racialized artist collective based out of San Francisco, and they created this terminology themselves, and then it got picked up by mainstream. So if you want to see that trajectory of like language and the importance, check out some of their documentaries and their videos on YouTube.
Thank you.
And I would encourage everyone to check out in the brief that we wrote. I mean, we really tried to sort of summarize a lot of really important issues, but we wanted to make sure that we included a ton of resources on kind of each topic that we really lightly talked about. We pointed to more information and more resources. So if you're able to, I would check it out. Not even as much for what we have written, but there's great resources in there as well.
Thank you so much. So I think that brings us to the close of this session. This has been really enriching and informative, and I learned so much from everybody here. So I wanted to thank you, Sarah and Grace and Jena, for writing and for speaking and for sharing your insights. Also wanted to thank everybody who joined us for this panel, despite your busy schedules, and also asking such great questions, which make my job so much easier. So thank you so much for being so engaged. I wanted to thank Also, the Gender Justice Now organizing team, Kat Owens, Nicole Bierce-Bolton, April Leather, team at Neole. And a couple of, I think, in closing, I wanted to just say what I've been thinking about as I was listening to everybody is that through intersectionality, we can honor our complexity. And I also wanted to note that often we use intersectionality as an analytical tool to understand oppression, and it's important that we maintain the focus on that. But I also learned that we can use intersectionality as a tool for potential, because it's only when all of our complex realities residing at different intersections are seen and honored, we can have gender equality. So for me, that's also a reminder to make sure that I'm not always centering myself in these conversations. So thank you everybody for joining. And I think that's a wrap. So hope you have a good day, and I'll see you at the next sessions.
Thank you, Rosel. Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists, Grace, Sarah, and Jena, for your incredibly important insights. I am truly grateful that we're going to be recording this panel so that I can go back and watch it again and I think learn even more. If you would like to learn more, I'd encourage you to also consider watching the panel again. We'll be sharing it on our YouTube channel. And I'd also encourage you to take a look at Grace and Jena's paper on intersectionality and law and legal systems. So we shared that in the Eventbrite email with you, but April will also share those links now in the YouTube chat. As I think I mentioned at the beginning, the full report is available in English only, but the executive summary is also available in French, and April will share both of those links. You can also visit LEAF's website, which is www.leaf.ca, to learn more about the work that our organization does and to potentially get involved as well. So thank you everyone for attending our discussion today. I don't know if I've ever seen a more engaged chat and set of questions, and we truly appreciate it. And we hope to see you